Good afternoon. This is Earth History, and this is our video lesson for Chapter 7. So this is all about evolution, and my hope is that this video will not be any longer than, say, 30 minutes, so that it will upload easily enough to YouTube and Canvas. All right, so notes are ready to go. Let's dig in. Everybody's heard of Charles Darwin, of course, because he came up with the theory of evolution. And he traveled around on a boat called the HMS Beagle, and that's a British boat. And he studied different animals in the Galapagos Islands, but he particularly studied finches and their beaks. And, basically he noticed that there were many different species of finches or other animals, and that they were different from one another, and they might have developed some very special characteristics that were useful, we'll say, only in the place where these animals lived. An example I like to give, and it's not on the board because I ran out of board space, cormorants. So cormorants are birds, and they dive underwater and fish. They're shorebirds. And in Wilmington, when I lived in Wilmington, I didn't live too far from Greenfield Lake. And I would go down there sometimes and walk or ride my bike, in the daytime, of course, because Greenfield Lake at night was a little bit scary. But anyway, there were cormorants, and they would fly. I watched them fly. I know for a fact that they fly. But in the Galapagos Islands, you have species of cormorants that don't fly. They actually have evolved to lose the ability to fly because they didn't need it. They didn't have predators there that they needed to fly away from. All right, Alfred Wallace. So that's a name you may or may not have heard of. So Alfred Wallace was actually working on his own theory of evolution pretty much at the same time. And I think they both published in their notions of evolution. But Charles Darwin is the one who's famous. Everybody's heard of Charles Darwin. Okay, so what is evolution? Well, it means basically, how do organisms change through time through something called natural selection. So we'll briefly talk about natural selection. So by the way, the only genetic mutations that are heritable, oh, I definitely misspelled heritable. That should be H-E-R-I-T-A-B-L. That's okay, I'm not going to change it. Anyway, the only genetic mutations that are heritable, meaning that they can be passed down to future generations, are mutations that happen in the sex cells. And by sex cells, we mean, of course, eggs and sperm. And these mutations can either happen in the genes or individual chromosomes. Okay, so to give you an example of genetic mutations that are not passed down, skin cancer. So I had a skin cancer adventure, I don't know, 4 years ago, something like that, 5 years ago, and I had a basal cell carcinoma on my cheek. And honestly, I know it was my own fault because when I was 18, 19 years old, I went to the tanning bed a little bit, on and off for a couple of years. So of course, that raised my chances of getting skin cancer. And I don't have children, but if I had had a child or two, there's no way that I would pass my skin cancer down to them because that was a genetic mutation that happened in cells on my face, not in the sex cells. Okay, so which mutations are gonna be passed down and, eventually might resort in new species? And that would be mutations that give some kind of advantage. So if you have a mutation that is advantageous, in other words, it allows that organism to live longer and to be able to reproduce. In other words, it's favorable variation. Those kind of mutations are likely to be passed down. Are there mutations that are disadvantaged? Oh, I'm just sorry, guys. It's been a very long day. Are there mutations that are not advantageous at all? Sure. Cancer, that's an example. Of course, that's not in the sex cells. But yes, you could have organisms that had mutations in the sex cells but the mutation made them actually easier for predators to find them. Well, that kind of mutation is not likely to get passed down because that organism that had that mutation is probably going to get predated upon before it can reproduce. Okay, scooting over and sitting back down. All right, other notes on evolution. So descendant populations will pass variations in greater frequency. In other words, if you've had, even just one individual that had one of these advantageous mutations and they reproduced, then some of their offsprings are likely to have that mutation. And if it's advantageous for the parent, it's advantageous for the offspring, then they are also likely to be able to pass it on. So you can get not just individuals, but entire populations, say in a breeding population, that can have these variations and pass them on. Speciation is a term we use to describe a new species arising from an ancestral species. Little note here, that third bullet down that you probably learned in a biology class at some point. Each offspring is going to get half of their genes from each parent. So I got half of my genes from my mom and half of my genes from my dad. Populations, so going kind of back to the descendant populations, passing variations in greater frequency. How do you get, these changes in population that, are carried on and passed down to offspring? So populations evolve due to reshuffling of genes. Oh, there goes the light. I knew that was going to happen. So we're going to walk over by the door. We got to go all the way over by the door to get the light to come back on. It's amazing how dark it gets in here when that light goes away. All right, so reshuffling of genes is very important in evolution, and this comes about due to sexual reproduction. All right, moving on. Next topic, phyletic gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. So phyletic gradualism, as the name implies, gradual changes, and these can be minor changes, very small, but gradual changes eventually bringing about a new species with these slow, minor changes through time. Now, punctuated equilibrium is different. There's really nothing gradual about punctuated equilibrium. This refers to no changes for a long time, but then quickly getting a new species to evolve. And what do we mean by quick? We mean a new species coming about in just a few thousand years. Okay, so that kind of time frame, a few thousand years, is actually pretty quick when we're looking at Earth history and evolution in particular. Okay, next we are going to distinguish between divergent evolution, convergent evolution, and parallel evolution. Beginning with divergent evolution. All right, what does this mean? Ancestral species evolving into diverse descendants that are very different from their ancestors. Okay, divergent evolution, as in, the evolution coming down the line, you end up with descendant species that are very different from the ancestors they might share. Okay, so a good example here, whales and horses, and there goes my phone ringing. Shame on me, I should have put that on silent. Okay, boy, today is just not my day for filming, but we need to get it done. Okay, back to where we were. It's a Monday, what do you expect? Okay, so whales and horses, think about it, whales and horses, they're quite different. I mean, yes, they're both mammals, they're placental mammals, but one lives on land, one is swimming in the ocean, One has 4 legs, one has, 2 flippers. So whales and horses, we don't think of them as being all that similar, but they come from a common placental mammal ancestor. Okay, so that was divergent evolution. What is convergent evolution? Well, similar characteristics developing in distantly related organisms that had similar environments. All right, so our example here, saber-toothed cats. This is one of my favorite Pleistocene megafauna animals because, well, it's a kitty cat. They had these really cool, weird-looking teeth. Honestly, I don't know why evolution thought that those teeth were going to be an advantage, but they did fine until the end of the Wisconsin Ice Age, and a lot of megafauna went extinct, not just the saber-toothed cats. But saber-toothed cats, so they evolved first in South America, and they did migrate into North America, and we know that because the Rancho La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, we have found, among other cool animals, the remains of saber-toothed cats in what is today Los Angeles. Just think about that. That's really cool. But anyway, so the saber-toothed cats evolving in South America were similar to marsupial carnivores in North America. Okay, so the saber-toothed cats were similar to the marsupial carnivores in North America. There are pictures of these animals in the PowerPoint for Chapter 7. So they were similar, but they were evolving on 2 different continents, okay? The marsupial carnivores in North America, the saber-toothed cats in South America. But when these 2 creatures were evolving, we did not yet have a land connection. Everybody knows now there is a land connection. It's called Central America, and that land connection did eventually allow for saber-toothed cats to migrate from South America up to North America. But the environments in South America and North America were pretty similar, which is why these 2 animals, the saber-toothed cat and the marsupial carnivores, evolved to look kind of similar. All right, moving on. Parallel evolution is next. Okay, so parallel evolution, to distinguish it from convergent evolution and divergent evolution. Parallel evolution, similar features developing independently in closely related organisms. And our example here, the kangaroo rat and the jerboa. So if you look in your textbook in Chapter 7, they're going to compare these 2 animals, and they are related organisms, but they are different species, different animals, but they are quite similar. So that's parallel evolution. All right, switching gears, macroevolution as opposed to microevolution. When you have an advantageous mutation in one individual and they therefore live long enough to procreate and have some offspring, that is microevolution. Macroevolution is origin of a whole new species or changes at a higher level. So macroevolution is related to this idea of descendant populations. All right, so our example for macroevolution would be birds descending from dinosaurs. So everybody knows that dinosaurs went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. That's one way to think of it. So your biologists and people that study Earth history might say, your paleontologists, they might say dinosaurs didn't really go extinct, they just evolved into birds. Okay, the dinosaurs are going to evolve from reptiles. The birds are going to evolve from the dinosaurs. Okay, so birds evolving from dinosaurs, that's a whole new species that was different from the dinosaurs, changes at a higher level. Okay, so our example here, Our oldest bird, which is Archaeopteryx, and there's a picture of Archaeopteryx somewhere in one of our chapters, and hopefully we'll try and take some time to look at some images in the PowerPoints. We actually did that today in my Monday group for Chapter 3, Plate Tectonics. Anyway, so the oldest bird, our Archaeopteryx, had feathers and a fused clavicle. Okay, so bird features, but also had many reptile characteristics left behind. All right, next topic, living fossils. So living fossils are animal species or plant species that have been around for a very long period of time with little to no change. So we have some examples here. My favorite example is called the coelacanth. There might be an E after the T, I'm not completely sure. The coelacanth. So this is an animal we had found fossils of. We knew it existed before 1938, but you know, we found these fossils in sedimentary rocks, and we could get, you know, using different dating techniques, we thought that coelacanths went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, along with the dinosaurs. But lo and behold, back in 1938, someone fishing off the coast of Madagascar caught a coelacanth. And we have found others since then. It wasn't just that one. Okay, so coelacanths did not go extinct. Their numbers apparently dropped to the point where we might almost have thought of them as cryptids, you know, or animals that some people claim are alive, but you can't ever really find proof of it. Well, we did find proof that the coelacanth is still alive. So the coelacanth has been going since the Mesozoic and still here. Other examples would be ginkgo trees. They've been around for many millions of years. Stromatolites. We're going to see that our oldest fossils, as in undisputed fossils, are stromatolites. I'll show you a picture at some point on a PowerPoint what a stromatolite looks like, or you could just do a Google search and look up any number of these things that you want to. Stromatolites are basically, they're algal mats, and they're very, well, they're not advanced creatures. They're basically single-celled organisms, but they build up these algal mats, and they can get preserved in the rock record. Well, stromatolites have been around for the past 3.5 billion years, and guess what? They're still here. We have living stromatolites in Sharks Bay, Australia. Horseshoe crabs. If you've ever seen a horseshoe crab at the beach, they're really cool. I prefer to see them alive in an aquarium setting, maybe, and sometimes they're in a petting tank, and you can actually like touch their shell, and they don't seem to mind. The horseshoe crabs have been around for many millions of years. And then there's one brachiopod, the Lingula brachiopod, and I mentioned this in a previous video lesson, chapter 4, 5, or 6, when we discussed that the Lingula brachiopod is not a good index fossil, because the Lingula brachiopod has been around since sometime in the Paleozoic, and it's the same species, and it hasn't changed. It's a living fossil. All right. Our next topic, and the last topic for our boards here on the side of the room. All right, homologous versus analogous structures. Okay, homologous structures. These are similar structures in organisms that come from a common ancestor, but the structures have different functions. So our best example would be forelimbs. Mammals have forelimbs, birds have forelimbs. Think about a dog or a cat. Their forelimbs are their front legs, and that's, you know, they're walking on those. They need them to walk. Shoot. All right. Light went out again. I really need a teaching assistant. They could just stand, I guess, by the door and make sure the light comes on. Of course, I don't have any money to pay a teaching assistant, which is why I don't have one. Okay, back to forelimbs in mammals versus birds. Forelimbs in humans, you know, we walk on 2 legs now. So our forelimbs have, of course, a different function than, say, our cats and our dogs. And then birds. Birds have forelimbs. They're called wings. And, of course, that's for a whole different function. That is to allow them to fly. or in the case of penguins, to allow them to swim really fast underwater and catch fish and avoid sea lions and other predators. Okay, how about analogous structures? These are structures that serve the same function, but are dissimilar, not alike, and have nothing to do with any evolutionary relationships. And the example here would be wings. So just wings, comparing wings in, say, birds, bats, and insects. So are all of these things, bats, of course, are mammals, if you did not know that. Bats are using their wings to fly, as are birds, as are insects. So the wings are serving the same function for each of these creatures, but they look different, they're not exactly the same, and they are not coming about from some evolutionary relationship. All right, moving on to the board in the front of the room. And now, of course, I will have to think about light glare, but you know what? It's a cloudy day outside, and it's looking to me like we're just not having that light glare. Well, then bring on the clouds. I need to film more on cloudy days. Nope, there's a light glare. All right. I didn't really see it until I looked at the board from that angle. Here we go. Now there's not so much light glare. Okay, now we're going to switch to the next topic, vestigial structures. Okay, so these are structures that organisms still have, and long ago, once upon a time, had a use for, but have evolved to no longer have a use for that structure, but still born with them anyway, okay? So our first example, wisdom teeth in people. So earlier humans did make use of wisdom teeth. We do not need wisdom teeth these days. And evolution is actually starting to correct for that, believe it or not. So, like I used to, you probably assume that every person is born with 4 wisdom teeth, whether we need them or not. So, when I finally had a job with some health benefits and dental insurance, and I could finally go to a dentist for the first time in like 30 years, not kidding. I went 31 years of my life without any health insurance or dental insurance. I only had 2 cavities in all that time. That's pretty good. Anyway, I could finally afford to get my wisdom teeth out. And the dentist was looking at my x-rays, and he said, well, you only have 2. He said, you've only got wisdom teeth on the top, not the bottom, so it'll be easier and it will cost less money. And I said to him, well, isn't that impossible? I thought all humans had 4 wisdom teeth. And he said no. He said they think it goes back about 10,000 years. Some people are being born with 3. Some people are born with 2, like I was. Some people are born with just 1. And even some people are being born without wisdom teeth. So evolution is starting to catch up there. The appendix. I don't know of anybody being born without an appendix. And often they may become inflamed, and I think that's because of there's a certain bacterial infection that a person can get that can make them more likely to have appendicitis. But they can take out your appendix and you live just fine. We're just not really using it, but that's a vestigial structure. I have cats because, well, I like them, and I'm gone many hours of the day, and they do okay without me. I like dogs. I just can't have one because, I'm gone for 12 hours a day. Dog would tear up the house. Anyway, but if you have a dog, or if like me, you just petted other people's dogs, they have something called a dew claw, which is an extra claw or toe that they just don't really need. And I believe it's a little higher up on their leg. I don't think it's right there on the foot pad. And they don't need this dew claw anymore, but they're still born with it. And my favorite example is the last one here. Whales have vestigial hip bones they no longer need. Whales don't need hip bones. They've got the vast oceans, and no matter how big the whale is, the big blue whales are the biggest animals on the planet. They do just fine swimming in the oceans. They don't need their hip bones, but they have them, and that's a relic left over from an ancestor that they evolved from. So whales actually evolved from an ancestor that walked around on land, and that's why they have a vestigial hip bone. I'm going to try sitting again, and it looks like the light glare is not too bad. So our oldest undisputed fossils are stromatolites, going back 3.5 billion years. Now there are some older possible fossils that might go back as far as like 3.8 billion, but we can say with certainty that we do have fossils going back at least 3.5 billion years. Stromatolites, single-celled, basically blue-green algae is what stromatolites are. But remember, stromatolites are also living fossils because we still have modern stromatolites in Sharks Bay, Australia. Has something to do with the correct acidity in the water there in Sharks Bay, Australia. Okay, so bonobos. A bonobo is a type of primate. They're super cute. I recommend, well, anywhere in this lecture you could stop and go to Google Images and look at these things. Anyway, the bonobos are really cute, and they're a type of primate, and they are the ones that are actually most closely related to humans, even more than, say, chimpanzees. All right, we are almost done. Let's try different angles with the light glare. Or rather, let's try different angles, trying to not have light glare. You know what? Do I need to open the iris a little more? Yeah, there we go. Okay, so just kind of a timeline here using arrows. So let's go through this, and it should hopefully make sense. Okay, kind of going from left to right is how we're going to read this, just like reading a book. Okay, so single-celled organisms evolved before multi-celled organisms did. That kind of makes sense. Plants evolved before animals. Those stromatolites, the oldest known fossils, 3.5 billion years, blue-green algae, plants. Ocean-dwelling organisms evolved before land-dwelling organisms, and our stromatolites were basically shallow